Rev up your engines! A Sienna that won't pass inspections. It's got a trouble code on. It runs perfectly fine, but he's in New Jersey. They do inspections. We'll give you a little history of it and see if we can figure out what's going on. Now, normally a Toyota Sienna will run forever, won't have any problems, but unfortunately, he bought this used and somebody had messed around under the dash. So they went in under the dash and, as you can see from this bill, they replaced the PCM harness and connectors with a used harness. Why a used harness? Well, numero uno, the wiring harnesses never go bad on these things unless some fool messes around with them or they get flooded and get corroded, and this wasn't flooded. Yeah, it makes sense. Why not get a used one? A new one would cost a small fortune. But he's still getting his check engine light on and he can't get his car inspected. He's got this plugged in. You never want to drive with something plugged in all the time. Those are called diagnostic ports for a reason. They're a port for diagnosing what's wrong with your car. They're not made for driving your car plugged in. Some manufacturers, when you plug them in, or even say, car is now in diagnostic mode, do not drive normally. We're unplugging, we're gonna leave it unplugged, and we're gonna plug ours in just to diagnose it. So we'll get this X tool, and we'll plug it in. Now, since they messed around with the gateway, and it's got a failure in the gateway, let's analyze that first. Airbag unit communication system. It's got a problem with the airbag system. Since the wiring harness inside here has been replaced, the airbags here, I'd assume something's probably messed up with that. Now, this is a Jersey car. It lives in New Jersey. I don't know what the law is in New Jersey, but in Texas, airbag does not make you fail your test. We will go back to the beginning, and we'll go up to the engine and ECT that has 7 failures. Control circuit of oxygen sensor. Control circuit of transmission range sensor. Oxygen sensor is stuck. Signal of oxygen sensor is lean. Now we'll look at his $1,230 bill, and we can see here they've replaced the neutral safety switch, which they called the mutual safety switch instead of neutral. I guess they don't know how to spell in Jersey. They really messed up the job they did with the wiring harness and reprogramming the computer, but they did reprogram the computer now. They did not replace the computer. Inside here, the actuators are going on and off and on and off for the HVAC system, the heating and the air conditioning system. It keeps recycling itself here. Definitely a sign that the wiring and or the computer is messed up. I got everything erased. Look, everything says normal. And we're going to go here and we're going to look at live data. Now, as you can see, the car is running perfectly fine. Long-term fuel trim is 0%. Means it doesn't have to add or subtract anything. And in a very short period of time, the check engine light's back on, as is the track off. Now, after resetting it, the first thing that popped was the heater circuit for the oxygen sensor on cylinder number 2. Number 1's over here, so that's a number 1, and this is bank 2. Bank 2, number 1, but they've replaced this a bunch of times. The code keeps coming back. Now, let's say this didn't have a wiring harness in the beginning with a problem that somebody had patched stuff in. The first thing I'd do would be change the oxygen sensor because it tripped. When I erased all the codes, it was the first thing that came up in 30 seconds. Realize one thing. Well, actually 2. He's already changed this twice and didn't help it, so obviously it's not the problem. There's 4 wires in here. There's a feed wire with power, there's wire to heat up the oxygen sensor, there's ground wire, and then there's a data transfer wire. Well, obviously the heater wire's not working because it's got data that the heater's not heating up. The computer supplies that. Obviously, it's not supplying it. It was AMCO transmissions that did the work. Yes, I know, shouldn't take electric work to a transmission shop, but the guy was told they're electronic experts at this store. Well, obviously, somebody's wires got crossed on that one. They're not experts. They should have really tested it, and they should have seen, hey, after we reprogrammed the computer and changed the wiring harness, and they got that code for the oxygen sensors, all they would have to do is hook up a meter and see there's no power going to the oxygen sensor heater. If they traced the wire and they'd see, well, we put the new wires on, they could check it to make sure they still got power, then they know the computer's not supplying power, that we shouldn't have reprogrammed the old one, we should have replaced it. If you want to go brand new, it's $963 bucks for a new computer for this, and then you got to pay somebody to reprogram. But the owner has found a place online where he can buy the computer and have it reprogrammed for the car for 300 bucks. He's going to take his out when it comes and unplug it and plug it in himself. It's not that big of a deal. But of course, the guys at AMCO should have done that in the first place. They should have checked it all out. They're obviously not experts. They had it for $1,214. So the owner contacted AMCO, said, what's going on? And AMCO refused to give them their money back. Well, he replaced the wiring harness and they reprogrammed the computer, and they're not going to give them the money back. even though it didn't fix the car. Of course, it makes absolutely no sense. It's an automatic transmission rebuilding company mainly. The point is they really shouldn't have worked on this car in the first place, and then the owner of the store isn't standing behind it, and AAMCO is not standing behind them. It's like you got two walls you got to get over with these people. Now, that's something to be learned, because years ago in Houston, I had a customer have the same problem. The place had changed the oil. They left the oil filter off on another Toyota, right? The Toyotas don't generally brake by themselves. Of course, they got down the street and the engine blew up. They towed it back and they said, okay, you got to fix our engine. You didn't put the oil filter back on. The guy at the shop wasn't going to do anything, just like the guy at this shop wasn't going to do anything. So they contacted corporate. They didn't say, well, we're not going to give you your money back. They said, those are privately owned franchises. You'll have to sue them. And of course, in that case, it was worse than this. He's out $1,200. He did get the wiring harness replaced with a used one. Didn't fix the problem, and maybe it was part of the problem, but it had shorted out the computer. They didn't finish the job is what it came out to. That was an engine. My customer in Houston, they actually sued the business, and they had to pay for another engine. They had to fork out like $3,500. It wasn't even a new engine. That was a remanufactured engine. But in this case, he'll have to shell out $300. Now, that's not bad. Only thing I'm hoping, they put the wiring harness in correctly and did a good job, because of course, if they buggered that up and he puts a new computer in and it shorts that computer out, then you're back to square one. Wiring harness just snaps in, comes out, snaps on. But since it plugs in, I'm assuming they put it in, they just didn't finish the job. But what I don't understand is these guys are supposedly electric experts at this AAMCO shop. You turn on a key, you see if it's sending the voltage, and if they saw no it isn't, they'd realize, okay, the computer's no good, we shouldn't reprogram it, we got to replace it. They should have just followed up, but instead, they told him to take it to a Toyota dealer because they don't know what's wrong. But they did not offer to refund his money. If I'd ever done something like that, I learned from my father decades ago, if the customer's not happy for whatever reason, just give them their money back. I gave 4 people their money back in Houston, Texas in 52 years. I wasn't in the wrong, but they just weren't happy, and I said, here's your $500 back, but don't ever call me again. And hilariously enough, that person 6 years later called me up to have me fix their car. But I've got a brain in my head, and I remembered, and I said, you're the one that said I didn't know what I was doing. I gave you the $500 back. Now you want me to work on your car again? Goodbye. Here's a lesson to be learned. Stay away from chain repair stores, especially if it's a transmission chain repair and they say they know how to work on electronics. And we'll find out what happens to his car when he gets a computer and throws it in. And here's some bonus questions and answers. Tritech says, my V8 engine, both banks are running rich. The dealer says he wants to change the intake and the oxygen sensors on both banks and said $4,000. Do I have to spend all that money? Well, depends what's wrong. If it's running rich on both banks, you don't need oxygen sensors. The oxygen sensors are the messengers. They tell the computer. And if it's saying it's running rich on both banks, that for some reason, you're either getting too much fuel or not enough air. There's an air restriction. The guy says he wants to change the intake manifold. To me, that generally doesn't make sense, because if you have like a leak in the intake manifold, it runs lean, too much air. Rich means you're getting too much fuel, which could be a mass airflow sensor, could be a leaking fuel injector. Now, more often than not, it would be a mass airflow sensor if both banks are running lean. Because if you have a leaking fuel injector, it's going to be leaking on one side, it's V8, the other side not, and you might have rich on one side, normal on the other. If they're both running rich, it has to be something that affects them both. And the mass airflow sensor feeds both sides. So if it's bad, it can get too much fuel. Or let's say you have a leaking fuel pressure regulator. Now the fuel pressure regulator regulates the fuel pressure for the whole engine. So if it's leaking, it will run rich, and it could be something as simple as that. I think those guys are completely off, and I would not go back to them, because they're saying, well, you need the oxygen sensor too. The oxygen sensors just report the information. They do not create the problem themselves in most cases. And if it says both are running rich, something is making the engine run rich, probably not the oxygen sensors. And they last, let's say if it did run rich and the oxygen sensors get dirty, once you start the car and run it, they clean off where you're driving down the road. They're self-cleaning devices, so I'd go someplace else. Norm Down Under says, I'm confused about what oil to use in my 04 Matrix. I got an 04 Matrix, it's low mileage, and only has 136,000 kilometers. I changed the 5W full synthetic 9 months ago. Now people are saying I should run 1040 due to the mileage and age. I've always used the 530, mine works perfectly fine. I like the Castrol full synthetic, it's great oil. You can use whatever brand you want. No, that's perfectly fine. You're down under, soon you're in Australia, like you say, it's milder there, it's hotter, doesn't get all that cold. It was actually designed for 5W30, so you might as well just stick to it. That's what I've always used in mine. It doesn't burn a drop of oil between oil changes, and it's got a little bit more miles than you got. So yeah, just stick to what you did, the 530 full synthetic oil. So if you never want to miss another one of my new car repair videos, remember to ring that bell.